welcome to the Redevelopment Agency of Salt Lake City Board meeting. Used to be we said what number it was, and I remember the first time I attended an RDA meeting and they were saying it was the 567th meeting or something like that. I thought, they're joking, right? And we don't say the number anymore. It kind of sounds a little too much like the Tabernacle Choir broadcast that says, "Welcome to the 1,372nd broadcast of the Tabernacle Choir." So we don't say that anymore, but welcome. We're glad you're here, and this is our last redevelopment agency meeting of 2017, and we will begin with item A on our agenda, comments to the board, and it would not be a fitting end to 2017 if we did not have a comment from our friend George Chapman. George, will you please come up, and you know the drill. Thank you so much.
Okay, you know what I'm going to say again and again and again. The RDA has $100 million worth of property, and it's not using it, and it should be using it, and keeping the property, if you look on the report, for over 10 years is ridiculous. That doesn't make sense, and we have an affordable housing crisis, we have a homeless crisis, and RDA's property can be used to take care of that and help development. So I'm asking you again to prioritize, refocus RDA on using that property and not just banking it for 10 years. And also we still need the homeless storage facility for working people, and I know you care about it. And finally, thank you for listening to me. And Lisa, especially thank you to you. I hope you stay involved. I think Sugar House needs more than one representative on the council, and maybe you can continue on that. I also appreciate and want to express thanks for the parking effort you put forward. I think it actually increased public engagement with the council. Thank you very much for that.
You are very welcome. Thank you. And is there anyone else who would like to address us today? All right. That being the case, we will move to agenda item B1, approval of the minutes for Tuesday, November 28th. Do I have a motion?
I'll move approval.
Second.
A second? Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. The minutes stand approved. Thank you very much. Next item B2, the RDA budget amendment number 3 for fiscal year 2017-18. And
Madam Chair,
for a motion. Thank you.
I move that the board set aside $3.2 million to facilitate redevelopment of the Capitol Motel. The board will consider an application for funding at the time it is received after the standard review and application process. And the board encourages the applicant to structure the project in a way that addresses the guiding principles adopted by the council in recent weeks.
Second.
Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
The motion passes unanimously. And Danny, do you want to say anything about the Capitol Motel? You provided us with a nice handout. If you don't want to, that's okay. But
Could
Danny
we-
Walls, COO, yes.
Invite Dan Ackerman from the Housing
Yeah, and
Authority.
Dan, will you come up as well?
Yeah,
Dan
in
Ackerman
the interest
from
of time, I mean, we
Housing.
provided that information for the board, and we were willing to speak to that or present that if that was the desire. I will just say quickly that we are in the process of starting to identify the details of the project with the Housing Authority. We are structuring that conversation such that it would come to you as a loan request as part of our process, and so that is how we are anticipating.
In that January meeting. The income mixes, of course, are of great interest to this entity, and we're working at either a 33% market rate or a 40% market rate threshold at this point. And also the size of the project. We have, like many parcels in this city, we have some sign issues that are not too negative, but we'll be asking for some direction from the RDA board at that time.
Board members, any further questions?
Did you say sign issues?
Yes, there is
As in
a
billboard?
Yeah, billboard.
That's what I
sorry.
thought, but
Yeah.
there's billboard on the property?
Yeah, there's a billboard on the edge of the property, and
East-west end.
and we have a fair amount of control over the solutions to that compared
Okay.
to some other issues.
Anyone else have other questions? I'd just like to take the opportunity, Dan, to thank you for taking the time to take me and I know other board members on a tour to see all the good work that you do. That was really beneficial for me, and I appreciate the work that you're doing for Salt Lake and how you're helping us answer the tough questions about housing. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you. We conversely congratulate you on what an impact you've had on this city, including affordable housing and homeless response and many other things. So I know that stint is wrapping up, and we appreciate your leadership. You've helped a lot of lives over that term.
Thank you very much, Dan. Gosh, this is going to be embarrassing all day. I want my kids to hear it, though, so that they know I'm okay, right? So, okay, thank you very much. Anything further? Yeah, Andrew.
One thing, Madam Chair, what part of the policy statements we made a few weeks ago, they're listed in here, that we're recommending to follow is about an equitable ratio across the city within these mixed income developments. And if we're going to look at 35 to 40% in this, I want to make sure we're clear about the other developments we're doing across the city, that there is equity. So we still don't have that fluctuations between different parts of the city and the percentage of affordability in these units. So.
Yeah, we looked very carefully at those. I believe they're up to 22 now, the council housing strategies. And this project meets 15 of those 22, and some of those 22 are not applicable to this project, like preservation of housing. So we paid very close attention to the written direction from many entities, but specifically from the council housing policies.
Sure. I'm just if we talk about other projects coming forward, that ratio of affordable units to market units is going to be important for me as one of the measurements.
Yes.
It's not saying they have to be exact, but I'd like to sort of hear why we'd look at 35 to 40% in one development versus, say, a 60 to 80% in another development somewhere else in the city, or 100% somewhere else in the city. So we understand the rationales behind those decisions. If that makes sense?
Yeah, and of course, there are some financing strategies guide some of that as well. We've heard fairly loud and clear, we think that if these are way on the west side, to try to push for opportunity development with higher incomes. And then if they're more of a Main Street downtown area, to go ahead and try to push workforce housing and affordable housing. So we've been massaging those issues the entire 6 or 8 months we've been working on this.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. All right, Danny, I hope you're comfortable. So it looks like you're going to be there for a while. We now go to item B3, the RDA 2016-2017 audit review. This is an annual review that is done in the interest of transparency and making sure everything is being done correctly. And we'd like to also invite Michael Michelson, partner at Ede Bailey, to join us. Am I saying it right, Ede, or is it Ide? Ide, okay.
Close enough.
I'd rather get it right. So.
It's interesting that you say it that way because that's our new kind of branding is hashtag I'd like, and we have posters about I'd like to be grateful, and so it's for recognizing our employees. So they're using that I'd pronunciation to try to teach people about that. So there you go. You're ahead of the curve already. Excuse me. My name is Mike Mickelson. I'm an audit partner at Ide Bailey. And we're here today to talk about our audit of the financial statements. With me is Trent Bateman, who's an audit manager and managed the engagement team during the audit. As a result of our audit, we issue several different documents. Those were provided just before Thanksgiving, I believe, at least in electronic form. So hopefully you already have a copy of those if you wanted to read those beforehand.
Fascinating reading, thank you.
I'd be kind of surprised if you did read them, but
It's funner to write them.
when we do an audit, just as a quick overview, we have some things that we start with in our planning phase. We establish a materiality threshold, and our audit standards require that we plan our audit to detect any misstatement above that threshold, whether it's fraud or error. So audits do have an inherent limitation that there might be misstatements or things below that threshold that we don't catch. And that's just because we can't spend a year auditing a year's worth of transactions. And so we have to have some way to be able to do it in a timely and efficient manner, to be able to report while it's still meaningful. So we establish a materiality threshold. We also look at the internal controls of the organization and gain an understanding of those, and document those in our work papers. And that helps us with our risk assessment, which is the third piece. We look at the different types and the nature of the transactions, what's going on in the organization, what maybe has changed, and with our understanding of controls and our understanding of the risks and doing that risk assessment, that tells us where to spend our time and how to focus our time during our audit and developing our further audit procedures. So that's where we start. We do those three things. Then we do those audit procedures and gather our audit evidence to determine what type of report to issue. We have issued an unmodified auditor's report this year, which is a clean auditor's report. It's the report that you always hope for. It's the report that we've always been able to issue for the Redevelopment Agency. And that's pretty much page 1 of the independent auditor's report. It talks also a little bit about management's responsibility for the financial statements, but concludes with our opinion that the financial statements are fairly presented in relation to generally accepted accounting principles for governments. Our report does continue on to the next page, and these are not modifications that in any way affect that clean opinion, but there is some additional information. The Governmental Accounting Standards Board requires that with governmental financial statements, right after our opinion, but before the first statement, management include what's called management's discussion and analysis that talks about some of the changes and has a couple of years worth of financial information and talks about the changes between the 2 years. In this case, you have 3 years in the MD&A because we present 2 years worth of information in comparative financial statements. And then there's some additional, that's called required supplementary information because it's required, as I said, by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board. Then they also require some additional supplementary information related to specifically to pensions. And so there's 2 schedules behind the footnotes that relate to the contributions and kind of the funding status of the pensions. And that's required as well. We do not audit MD&A or those pension schedules. We do some very limited procedures to make sure that the information in them is consistent with what's in the financial statements, but we do not opine on those statements. And so the first paragraph at the top of page 2 just lets financial statement users understand that it's required, but we don't opine on it, and we do those limited procedures. The last paragraph refers to some additional schedules that management of the Redevelopment Agency provides in the back related to combining statement of revenues and expenses by project area, and there's also a combining balance sheet by project area. So that's a lot more detail on the 2 main statements broken out by the project areas. We do opine on that in the form of an in relation to opinion. That means that we do some limited procedures there to say that in relation to the main financial statements, those schedules at the back are fairly stated. And so we've done a little bit of work. The total column should tie to the main financial statements. It's part of what we look at in our review and everything there. So those are not audit opinion modifications, but they're more information for financial statement readers to understand what's here and what is ours versus what is the organization's. So it was an unmodified report, as I said. I also talked about the fact that we look at internal controls in our risk assessment process and our planning. At the end, then, we're also required to determine if, as a result of that review and documenting our understanding, there are any things that we determine to be weaknesses in internal controls or areas where internal controls might be able to improve. This year, as a result of a lot of turnover and a lot of cleanup and final accounting specifically for the big project downtown, the Performing Arts Center, we did have audit adjustments as a result of our audit procedures. And usually those things are cleaned up and reconciled and taken care of before we come. But because we found them as a result of our procedures, we consider those to be audit adjustments. And so then we have to look at those and see if maybe there was a breakdown in internal control. So this year in our management letter, we have communicated a material weakness in internal control related to the volume of the audit entries that we had this year because of some of those issues. So we've issued a second letter that discloses those material audit adjustments. We prepared the financial statements and the footnotes, which is not unusual in the government arena for the auditors to do that. But in an instance where we have a lot of audit adjustments, then that usually means the financial statements would have been material misstated without those. And so we've included financial statement prep with that instead of issuing two separate findings, because I don't think we need to. So they've been combined into one finding. The views of responsible officials is included with that. And so if you've read that letter, as you said, it was riveting, then you've been able to read that, the views of the responsible officials and what remediation they're planning to help remediate those control deficiencies going forward. The final thing we issue is when there is a governing body, such as this board, that has the responsibility for governance. We have another letter that we're required to issue. Talks about our responsibilities and some of the other things that we look at and find in an audit. Sections of it are kind of pretty boilerplate and the same from engagement to engagement, and a few of them change. I've asked Trent to just highlight some of the areas that might be a little bit different for the RDA than for other parts of the city.
So the first section of the letter really is boilerplate. It just reminds you that our job is to audit the financial statements. These are not our financial statements, they're the RDA's financial statements, and management is responsible for those financial statements. Inside the letter, it talks about significant accounting policies of the RDA and directs the readers to note 1 of the financial statements. That's where all the significant policies that the RDA follows are disclosed to financial statement readers. Within the financial statements, inherently you're going to have estimates, accounting estimates, and we've gone through those estimates, and we feel like a significant one that we need to inform you about is the net pension liability of the RDA. Accounting's not always black and white. You know, nobody knows what the RDA is going to pay in the future for pensions. So management of the RDA has done their best job to estimate what those future payouts are going to be. And so we've audited that estimate, the assumptions that went into the estimate, and we feel like it's reasonable.
Sorry, Trent. That estimate also comes from Utah Retirement System. So a lot of that's out of the city's control, and you're probably familiar with that in the city's statements. But with the number of assumptions that go into that actuarial determination, that's all it is an estimate, and that will change from year to year as those assumptions change. So.
You're good, thank you. Mike previously mentioned that there were some journal entries that were booked as a result of our audit procedures. We don't always book the entries. We take materiality into consideration, and if some of those entries are really small, we'll just pass on it and say no one really cares about it too much. But if it's over a certain dollar threshold, we still let you know about it. And so there is one past adjustment that's in that letter, and you can read about that if you want, but management feels like it's immaterial, and we agree, so it wasn't recorded as a result of our audit procedures. Then the rest of the letter is really boilerplate until you get to the end. At the end, it discloses all the journal entries recorded as a result of our audit procedures, and they're all just listed as a supplemental schedule to the letter.
Those are the required communications that we need to make. That last letter, communicating the results of our audit in the auditor's report and in the management letter. So What questions can I answer? Do you have any questions for us related to the audit process or to anything we've issued or anything you read?
Board members, anyone have any questions about it? That makes it easy.
Sure does.
Thank you for your work on this, and thank you to the RDA staff and team for doing that, and
Yeah, that
thanks
was
to our finance
our staff
department.
in the finance department, so.
Yeah. Yes, and I will look for a motion
Chair,
to accept the audit. Yeah.
I move that we accept the audit for 2017.
Is there a second? Motion by Board Member Mendenhall, second by Board Member Luke. Any discussion? All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, it's unanimous. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right. We move to B4, RDA bonding scenarios, and we're going to have Danny and Ben and Mary Beth join us. And Jen, you can chime in from here.
Mixing it up on us.
And Mary Beth, do you want to join them? Is that okay? Thank you. And I'm just going to invite you to just go through this as you wish. And
Yeah,
board members, if you have questions, we'll do that, and we'll do as deep a dive as you want to do, or we'll stay in the shallow end if we need to. So whatever you choose. Okay.
Let me
go ahead.
start by thanking council staff. I believe they were the spearhead and the leaders on the analysis from George K. Baum in that bonding capacity memo that I believe was discussed about a month ago initially. And so what we as the administration and RDA staff wanted to do is, in response to that original memo, was to follow up with the board and have a conversation as we looked at those projects and the analysis within that bonding memo and some of the recommendations or analysis that came out of that, and come back to the board and have the discussion with regard to those projects on what we felt could either be a solution on how to proceed with those projects with cash on hand or other funding sources that we've identified, and or have a discussion with the board in terms of what some of the priorities for those projects are and possibilities for moving forward if we did not bond. In the staff memo, you'll note that as part of the administration, we are not recommending bonding at this time. And one of the reasons for that is because a lot of the projects are within project areas that are expiring soon. And so as part of what the memo stated was it's just not feasible from the tax increment from those project areas. And that the recommendation of the bonding analysis was such that in order to bond, we would most likely have to encumber program income funds, and that likely that would also be a combination of having to do a city sales tax bond if we wanted that bond to be more attractive. So given light of that, we felt that we would come back before the board and try to propose a different kind of solution, and then for the projects that either were not capable of being bonded, try to direct staff in terms of some larger policy issue conversations that we could have to try to identify funding sources for those projects. So having said that, I'm willing to go through any details or answer any questions in terms of our memo or the status of the projects or what we've proposed.
Okay. Board members, you have specific thoughts on these answers to the questions about bonding? Aaron, go ahead.
But when we say cash on hand, is it strictly PIF money?
No,
Can you
what
break
we've
that
gone
down a
through is
little
we've
bit?
gone through within every account and project area account, we've identified what we felt would be cash available for these projects. And so that's a combination. Primarily, it's the tax increment within the project areas, but for some of the projects, you'll note that we did use PIF funds, and those were either existing allocations or funds that at one time were earmarked for projects.
Derek? Oh, go
Can I
ahead,
follow
Aaron.
up on
Yeah.
that?
Yeah.
On the funds that were previously earmarked for projects that maybe didn't happen or aren't happening, it seemed like we swept that couch cushion out.
Yeah, and so a lot of those funds are ones that are in the current RDA CIP allocations that just have not been
As
approved or
pared down as
finalized.
they've
Yep.
become.
Yeah.
And do we have a list of or when might we be able to see the cash on hand per project area? And is it, I apologize if it's in here, but I didn't see it in here.
I don't believe it was in the specific memo. Those were numbers we worked with the finance department on getting, and then incorporating those within our proposed funding for the projects.
So the previous cash on hand balances were with the bonding documents that we did. So we
Okay.
gave you cash balances along with what we projected to be the tax increment going forward based on, most of the assumptions were based on a 2 or 3% increase on the TI increases. You know, some project areas are increasing higher than 3%.
Mary Beth, can you stop for just a second? Chris, George, can you hear her in the back? You can tell she's speaking. Yeah. The mic was a little bit a ways away, so, okay. I figure when people say, raise your hand if you can't hear, how are they supposed to know to respond to that? So I always ask someone at the back if they can hear. Okay.
Okay.
Right into the mic.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
So when we did the bond, when we gave the information to George K. Baum, we went through every single project area, determined the cash balance at that point in time, and then also projected out the TI. TI was projected out either on a 0% increase, 2%, or 3% based on the project area. Some project areas were higher than 3%, but making a conservative estimate due to not knowing what the economy is going to be doing and projecting some of those out 10 years. I didn't want to go too far off that 3% increase.
So if I look back to the October RDA meeting when we had BOM present to us, I should be able to see the
spreadsheet
cash availability totals for each project area.
at that point in time.
It's
It-
the
Jennifer?
attachment, the second attachment in the paperwork for this packet item right now. And then if you scroll to the very end, but I think rather than try to find it in the
I won't do
morass
it
of
right
the
now.
paperwork, we'll get it to you guys in a more kind of readable format.
And if you'd like updated cash balances, we can work on those as well.
Okay, so can I keep going, or Derek, did you want to jump in
No,
on
go
the
ahead.
same subject? I'm looking at the staff report and the breakdown with the project, the RDA staff recommendation, any notes or questions, and on the second page, where we're looking at the maintenance costs of $400,000 per year at Station Center for the infrastructure that we're looking at installing. I wondered how that compares to Regent. And I know that's asking you to name a number off the top of your head.
The 400,000 came from conversations with the city departments, and essentially that number was derived from taking an average cost per linear foot from the CBD maintenance expenses that they provided, and then applying that to 300 South. And so I'm not sure, so it's based off of their existing costs in relation to Regent Street. Our preliminary estimates on Regent Street range anywhere from $70,000 to $150,000 of annual maintenance costs for that block.
A fraction of the Station Center maintenance cost.
Potentially, yes.
It's a much smaller area to
Yeah,
maintain.
But it is a programmed area, and I know that there's separate funding that
Right.
we have through the cultural core.
I don't think the 70,000 includes any programming.
No, doesn't include any programming, and as of right now, there is no identified funding source for that. The RDA is covering that cost for the current year until we can identify that funding source moving forward.
Well, I feel like I'm channeling Andrew Johnston, and I don't need to because he's right here, to say that it's excellent that we identify what the ongoing maintenance costs would be before we, approve spending or contemplate spending on a capital infrastructure project. I appreciate having that number. It seems quite high.
It's also, it encompasses 6 blocks total. It's not just 300 South. It would be 300 South, both
The
sides,
T.
and then the north and south as well, along with Pierpont and Market. So it's a much larger area than just Regent Street. And so that's why applying the average cost per linear foot is how they came
And
up with that higher
are
number.
have we contemplated any kind of a, I don't know the terms for it, but some kind of a,
Assessment area?
thank you.
No, we have not identified any potential sources for funds in terms of an owners association or an assessment area or anything like this. at that
I
time.
would like to kick that out to all of you, that we start considering that early now. Although I know we already have some contracts and some agreements happening in that district, but $400,000 a year to fall on the RDA for ongoing maintenance of this area is, I think, more than I have the appetite to look at in our budget every year, and I think should be a part of the agreement we have with occupants on the street there.
And
Jennifer
just,
Bruno?
just to follow up, it would fall to the city because it's not an eligible RDA expense anymore. So it would fall to the city general fund to maintain if an SID was not set up. Previously, there had been discussions, I know in the Sugar House context, that property owners' support of an SID, because an SID is a legal binding agreement that the property owner agrees to pay sort of an extra property tax to offset the maintenance cost. And in Sugar House, there were some clauses written into some of the contracts when the city sold land to developers or when the city got into agreements with developers that they would not protest any future SAAs should they be proposed. So even though details aren't, completely figured out right now, that could at least buy the RDA or buy the city, I should say, some future conversation. I don't know, just an idea.
Madam
Good.
Chair, it's your last meeting, but I'd like to request of you and Board Vice Chair Kitchen that we look at this in a future RDA meeting. Look at the creation of an SID or an SAA for the Station Center area for ongoing maintenance.
Okay, noted by those who will be here.
I have another one I
Okay.
wanted to ask
That's
about
all
on the
right.
Fourthwest reconstruction. There's no mention in this little blurb we have here on Fleet Block, which is like the gaping hole in that area. Can you give us anything on
I
Fleet
can
Block?
give you the information I have as of an hour ago as part of a
That
meeting
fresh?
on that.
That hot off the
well,
press?
our meeting was with Housing and Neighborhood Development in terms of Fleet Block and their plan for moving forward, and the idea of putting that out to market for developers and identifying through the city and a consultant what the economic feasibility of that would be, as well as the design and the proposed costs, so that when it goes out to market, those can be identified up front and part of the negotiations and proposals from developers. And so the city is moving forward with that plan to get that out on the market as soon as possible and do so in such a way that they've tried to identify as many of the questions regarding Fleet Block as possible.
So I want to hear from you on this, but before I hand it off my questioning, I think that this $1 million suggestion just to do the construction level design without any additional commitment on the behalf of the RDA or the city to actually execute on the construction that's so badly needed, the deconstruction and the reconstruction of a functional street there, really seems like a missed opportunity if we're finally going to get Fleet Block off the ground, and a leverage point for the future dialogues with developers who might be looking at that area and seeing this street, which is in deplorable condition. So I guess I'd like to hear from Board Member Kitchen about that.
Do you have anything further, Board Member Mendenhall?
No, not at the moment.
Anybody else? So I have a couple questions. When I'm looking at this table here, and when you speak about cash on hand, are you referring to project area cash on hand, tax increment for each project area, or could that include PIF as well?
It primarily includes tax increment from project areas. There are some of these projects that incorporate PIF funds because of their current allocation within the PIF account.
I see. Okay. And I guess, I'm looking at some of these, projects that we were considering for bonding, and I think, our philosophy was that we wanted to look at bonding so that we could get as many of them done at the same time as possible. Because the way that it's mapped out here, it looks like we could be, 10 or 12 years down the road before we see any of them come to total fruition, especially Fourthwest. Like, even if we spent $1 million on the construction level design, if we don't have funding lined up to actually move forward, that could be $1 million wasted, because that, 8 years from now, that may not even be relevant any longer. So I don't know what my question is, but I'm not really comfortable with this answer for Fourthwest in particular. And, we do, let me see. we do have 2 project areas that expire in a couple of years, about 5 years, right? The Depot District and Granary. And I know that in smaller meetings, we've discussed the potential of maybe either extending them or redrawing the project area boundaries. And I guess I'd like to toss that out to the board and maybe talk about what our thoughts are on moving forward in that direction, because I agree with Board Member Mendenhall on the missed opportunity with Fourth West, just as an example. You know, I know that we've reimbursed property owners on Fourth West for their effort in curb and gutter construction, Art Space in particular, but as well Volunteers of America. So, you know, it's like we've made a little bit of an effort, but we haven't run the ball all the way down the field. And so it does feel like a missed opportunity if we don't come together and create a game plan for getting something like this finished. And especially as we're looking at the project area expiring in a couple of years, I would be looking for more direction, either from staff or from this body, so that we don't walk away from it in this current condition.
I would say that we as staff 100% agree with that. And really all we're saying at this point is that we don't feel that bonding is that solution, given the size of some of these projects and the costs, and the fact that there is difficulty in terms of spending funds from other project areas and outside of that project area. And so when you look at some of the costs of these projects, there's no way to do them within their own project area. And the solution, we don't feel, is bonding against PIF. And so we would say, yes, you're absolutely correct in the thought that we need to come up with a direction on how we want to proceed with funding these. And based on the memo of the bonding and the financial analysis, we just don't see that as a bonding solution right now. And what we have provided is what we feel is a viable solution for moving forward with the projects that we can identify right now, that we do have some funds available. And then on the other projects such as undergrounding or 400 West, that we take that step back and figure out if there's another way to get there.
So, yeah, Board Member Mendenhall, please.
That was the one other piece that I didn't bring up. I was going to say that we should start dialogue now around extending the station center, the Depot District project area, because of the plans we have around the station center and the stage of development that we're at. I think it's realistic that we aren't going to be ready to sunset this in 2023, and I don't see the point in waiting till 2020 to make that extension. And if we get to a point, which I think you and I sounds like we agree on Fourth West and coming to more of a commitment than just the design, then I could be open to talking about the extension on the Granary too. But I think absent that would be a catalytic project. Fleet Block would be, of course, a catalytic project for that area. And absent either of those, there's no point in extending that project area to me. But I'd like to start those dialogues sooner than later.
Yeah, I agree. I'm not very warm to the idea of extending the Granary District project area. Instead, I would rather find a way to move forward to complete the catalytic project of Fourth West. And so what I'm hearing is that we don't have the resources to do it unless we bond, but bonding isn't what you guys want to do as staff. So there's no real, I mean, we have, it sounds like, one option, which is bonding, unless we use the general fund in the city count, from the city side. And we don't have the resources there to do something like Fourth West. So any ideas on how we would get there?
I don't know if that's looking at a special assessment area or an SID. I don't know if that's incorporating it, if it's even possible to incorporate it in the impact fee costs and build it through something like that. I don't know if it's a process of the city bonding and maybe the RDA can be a partner in servicing that bond, but not necessarily the 100% that maybe was originally anticipated within the bonding. I mean, I think that's exactly what we're saying, is we don't know what that other solution is, but I think that's a conversation that we need to have, because we don't feel that it can be 100% RDA, and so we have to come up with some other ideas.
Board Member Mendenhall?
I think that this council set streets as our priority for the last 2 years, and I think we're all really hungry to actually pull the trigger on something big for streets. And this could fit in very well with that kind of a dialogue that I hope is coming up soon, and perhaps the RDA being a part participant in that, in the cost around Fourth West, is a way to include Fourth West, and then the reality of the fiscal needs on that street, which are great in that discussion.
Thank you. I just would like to state for the record that I will likely not be a proponent of extending the project area in Granary District, potentially Depot District, but if we're in the middle of creating the Northwest Quad, 9-line, State Street, and then 2 extensions, I just have a hard time asking for that from our taxing partners. I don't see it as something that they would have the appetite for either. And so I think that it's important for us as the board of the redevelopment agency. I think it's really important for us to figure out a way to finalize our vision for Fourth West and the catalytic project in the Granary District before that project area expires. Now, I realize that we don't necessarily have a lot of incoming tax increment, so we are going to have to be creative with how we get there. So if we're willing to have that conversation when we talk about streets citywide, however that conversation takes shape, then by all means. But I just really wanted to toss that out there. This is my neighborhood and my district, and it's just, I'm not seeing the opportunity for the Granary.
Mr. Chair, I think we need to have a much more robust discussion about continuation of project areas. I remember when we extended the Sugar House area, there was a lot of pushback on that, and I'd love to hear from the attorney's office and the RDA staff why the pros and cons and the balance test that we're talking about. I think that we need to really dive into that if that's a discussion we're going to have. And then my question, the way I look at it in regards to bonding, really most of the project areas here, except for maybe Central Business District or North Temple or Block 70, there's really no reason to bond for them because you don't have the time frame that you really need out of them. Whereas these other areas, they've got 20 years left on it where actually you can make it up. Is that correct?
Yes.
So, I mean, if we're really thinking about bonding, I would much rather see projects in those areas that we could analyze and say, okay, if we really wanted to bond, this is one case scenario that we could really look at. So for me, I'd like for us as a board to find project areas in this area if that's the way that we really want to go, because we're going to get most bang for our buck to make sure that that happens.
Thank you, Board Member Rogers. Board Member Johnston.
I agree. It'd be interesting to see what our projections looked like if we had 4 areas, CBD and then 3 other areas, right? Because most of these areas don't generate a whole lot. I mean, we're looking at CBD doing most of the work, right?
Yeah, CBD is the one you have the most capacity in, and
Yeah.
the one that doesn't have any of these projects in.
Exactly. I mean, I'm not saying that it should always be the way, because we need to keep downtown vibrant, et cetera. But by overextending ourselves, we don't get anything done, really. And I'd be very interested to see in the 2 new project areas coming up, if we identify projects up front that need to be the catalytic project that would require funding from elsewhere in the RDA to jumpstart it, because if we don't have projects identified, it's sort of pointless to say, well, I've got this money and I have the idea about getting some money, but I need to figure out what to do with it.
Yeah.
I think it's sort of counterintuitive. The smart thing to do, it seemed to me, is that you'd figure out what would jumpstart economic growth, so that you can make back the money and more very quickly, or as quickly as possible. And I think we're sort of backwards in this in some ways. So I would agree with Councilmember Kitchen about being very, very wary about extending life of areas. I'd be much more interested in identifying very specific projects from staff's perspective, administration's perspective, that would generate tax increment within whatever time period we're talking about, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, and then kind of this discussion about what we do, because I don't think we're going to get anywhere like this.
Any further comments on bonding? Go, Danny. Want to say
Sorry,
something?
if
Yeah,
there aren't any
go ahead.
other questions, I'd like to make the staff request, which is, as part of our memo, we did put out the idea of proposing land write-downs within Station Center and using the cash on hand to get that project started. And so what I would ask for direction from the board on that idea, such that if that is something that is acceptable, that we could then return with potentially term sheets on those 2 properties that we have under contract and try to move forward with those projects in that way. If that's something that the board does not want to discuss or provide direction, then we can adjust accordingly, but
I think just a minor clarification of logistics, trying to keep my head straight with roles here. I think the board would have to approve the land write-down,
Yes.
specifically the amount of the land write-down, because it would be a budget action. I'm looking at
Correct.
Katie. Throw something at me if I'm wrong. Because it would, in a sense, be a budget allocation to say, instead of selling this land for $3 million, we're going to sell it for $1 million and credit that $2 million for this developer putting in infrastructure, instead of asking that developer to pay for the full $3 million. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
we
it's
wouldn't
not
be
like
asking
you
for
guys
that,
used to
yeah.
do, where you would approve the term sheet. It's
It would-
just approving the plan.
yep, it would come back to you as a term sheet that you would have to exactly approve the specific land write-down amount. But if that's not something that the board has an appetite for, then we won't proceed that way with the projects.
Madam Chair,
Yes.
I would bring back the item that I brought up at the beginning, that in order to consider approval of that kind of a term sheet with a land write-down, that I would want to see the type of language in the contract that would make that developer agreeable to an assessment area or other mechanism for us to collect ongoing operation expenses from those landowners.
We could include that language in the agreements now, that they would agree to that.
Otherwise, I am open to this.
I'm going to take a straw poll on this. Those in favor of looking into a land write-down and getting the details, all in favor of that? Just getting the details on it, yeah. Okay, way to go, Stan. Okay, it's unanimous. Welcome, Stan. Okay, so we don't want to waste your time, but
No, that
so we
gives
want to
us
give
the
you some
direction that we
direction
can
to,
proceed, and
then we'll look at that and see. Well, some people will look at that and decide if that's how they
we'll bring
wanna
that
go.
back, and the board
Okay.
can decide at that time if they want to approve that. Thank you.
Okay. Anything further on discussing bonding scenarios? Or Ben or Jennifer, do you have anything to add?
We'll get you some more detailed information, just in a more kind of user-friendly format for the next discussion.
Great. All right. We move to number 5, the project area creation process and update on 9 Line and State Street. And we have a handout that goes with this. Danny, are you going to stay where you are?
I will stay, but I will
Okay, and we'll
pull up
invite
with
Tammy
me,
Hunsaker
Tammy
and Suze Lundmark to come up. And Tammy, as you join us, can we, as a board, congratulate you on the honor that you received? Yeah, we're proud of you. And for people who don't know what we're talking about, we're going to make you just brag a minute and tell about the honor you received.
Oh, well, thank you. I think you're speaking of, I received an award recently from the Utah Housing Coalition for Person of the Year. So, yeah.
Way to go. We like to know the person of the year.
Yeah.
That's great. Congratulations
you.
and well deserved. Okay, tee us up on these 2 areas.
Great. Thank you, Madam Chair. So today we have for you some of the various plan components that will be compiled into the larger project area plans for State Street and 9 Line. So today, as per the schedule we delivered in the October meeting, we're delivering standards to guide project area development, and we're really looking at these as goals of the project area. And then also furthering the purposes of Title 17C, and we're looking at these as specific tactics to carry out the goals that we've developed. We also have for you geographic target areas for which we're proposing to concentrate and focus funding to maximize impact within the areas. So jumping into the 9 Line, first of all, the 9 Line draft goals were actually really easy to come up with because we took them straight out of the 9 Line master plan. The 9 Line master plan was adopted, I believe, in 2014, and there was extensive public outreach that was done as part of this master plan process. So we are proposing to use the goals, including encourage compatible mid and high density development to complement the existing stable single-family neighborhoods, really focus on the community and regional nodes within the area to build up commercial and mixed-use nodes and also regional nodes that will help expand the employment base in the area. Of course, enhancing the natural assets and the recreation opportunities that are already in the 9-line, and doing such things as strengthening the neighborhood connections between Poplar Grove and Glendale and other areas within the neighborhood. There are some geographic barriers within the 9-line that exist. So those are straight out of the 9-line master plan. So we have 5 different objectives for each project area, starting with neighborhood revitalization. And this is really looking at the neighborhood and trying to capitalize on redeveloping or revitalizing distressed buildings or vacant lots to trigger tax increment and neighborhood revitalization. So we're proposing such items as identifying catalytic project sites, collaborating with other divisions and departments where we can, so working with civil enforcement to make sure that ordinance and regulations are being enforced. And really looking at supporting high quality, enduring building materials and projects that will enhance the neighborhood and create placemaking and other qualities that will make the 9-line area a neighborhood that people want to visit and live in. Commercial corridors really goes back to the neighborhood nodes that have been identified through the 9-line plan and enhancing those nodes with commercial and mixed uses. We've heard a lot from the community that they wish there were more places to go out to eat or a coffee shop in the area. So incorporating those into mixed use projects to also provide a diversity of housing types in the neighborhood. They're mostly single family homes, so getting some more apartments and multifamily housing within the neighborhood. And then looking at the commercial corridors as a whole and really creating a vibrant, pedestrian-friendly, safe experience within those corridors. And then the 9-line has opportunity to enhance employment centers, particularly west of Redwood Road, and then also there's an area that's zoned M1 just west of I-15. So looking at these underutilized land areas and trying to incorporate economic development, bring in businesses, looking at particularly at the M1 west of I-15, how we can incorporate kind of buffered land uses within the area because there's an industrial area butting right up against residential. So enhancing the neighborhood that way through the employment centers. And then of course with housing, I just spoke of incorporating mid and high density housing options into the 9-line. Also looking at how we can incorporate missing middle into existing single family neighborhoods. Looking at leveraging tools the city already has, particularly the Community Land Trust. How can RDA efforts within the 9-line leverage that tool within the city? And then, of course, we've heard a lot from the community, especially on the west side, about affordable housing, and there's this ongoing dialogue about AMIs over there. So making sure that we continue to engage the community and implement mixed income projects that serve a wide variety of income levels. Public spaces and transportation, really it's highlighting what the 9-line area already has with the parks and the trails, creating safe, walkable neighborhoods. And I spoke before about the connectivity to other neighborhoods within the city. And then the 9-line geographic target areas, there's some nodes along the 9th South corridor at 4 South, 8 South, and 9 South. And then the area just west of I-15, that's the industrial area I was just speaking of, creating some more appropriate land uses, buffering the residential neighborhoods. Then looking at the opportunity we have at the Indiana Avenue at Navajo node, Hand owns some property there, so looking at establishing more of a mixed-use node in that neighborhood along Indiana Avenue. And then there's a great opportunity along Redwood Road to not only enhance the commercial corridor, but also create a kind of a gateway to the Poplar Grove neighborhood along Redwood at Indiana Avenue. And that's also an important crossing and connection for the 9-line trail itself. So those are the identified target areas we have. And Madam Chair, I don't know if you'd like to take questions on 9-line.
Yeah, I would like to do that. Board members, questions about the 9-line? Andrew? I kind of thought you might have a question.
Thank you very much, Tammy, for all this. I agree with almost all of it. Um, the piece that is I'm wondering about is the area on the far west of Redwood Road to 215, which is all industrial. How much of that does the city own at this point? Do you have a sense of that?
So the city actually owns, I can't remember the acreage right off the top of my head, but the northwest corner there.
The entire brown area right now?
Right, and it's, we can return with additional information, but it's my understanding part of that is an old landfill, so the redevelopment potential of that still needs to be further assessed. There's the solar field on there as well.
Mm-hmm.
So within the project area itself, about 25% of the land area is actually owned by Salt Lake City. So that's quite high.
Yeah, it's quite high. So the question for me, though, is a reinvestment area. It would seem to me that we need a lot more work done on that west end, particularly.
Mm-hmm.
If we're going to maximize tax increment reimbursement back into the fund, that's where that's going to happen, I guess. And we don't know much about the remediation issues out there. But I know this focuses a lot on, say, Indiana, Navajo, and 9th West, both 4 South and 9 South, et cetera, and it's great. But I don't know if we're going to generate much out of that, right?
Right.
So I'd be interested in hearing a lot more about information on that corridor by I-215, because that may unlock any sort of economic benefit we're going to get out of this.
Sure. Yeah, we could actually take a closer look at that area and see, kind of do an analysis of the redevelopment potential of some of those parcels. Because I do know redevelopment has been occurring with the soccer stadium, the charter school, other efforts that have been happening over there.
Yeah, and it's a tough area because it's so mismatched in a lot of ways. I mean, it's an industrial park, and then we have a charter school in the middle of the industrial park, and we've got 2 indoor soccer facilities in the industrial park. The other issue for me is we didn't mention anything about the 9-line master plan, and it may not be a major part of this because the West Side master plan is the bulk of this. But there's no destination going west on the 9-line, and part of that being an active corridor is probably going to rely on having things out there that you go to, right?
Right.
Some destination, some reason to be there, whether it's housing out there, talking about on Redwood Road, which is zoned for it, or something else out there that draws you there to anchor that west end of the area. That's why this west end of the area is intriguing to me, because we haven't talked much about it, and there's so many questions about it, but I think it holds the key to this being successful. So I'd like to hear more about that if we can spend time on that.
Definitely.
Thanks.
I also would like to note there's another section of the plan where we can identify specific projects if the board so chooses. So that will be an opportunity going forward as well.
Madam
Excellent.
Chair, can
Yes, go ahead.
piggyback off of that? Because Andrew, when I looked at this map that we have here, the Google map that shows the development south of 9th South there, that wasn't there when we started contemplating this project area. It hadn't even happened. And I wonder if we shouldn't consider backdating our tax increment collection here. I know that's something that we can do, and when we started talking about this project area, none of those pads were there, or very few of them compared to now. And that's something we can do if the other taxing entities agree to it.
I think it'd be a smart thing to look into, because you're right, anything south of 9th South is almost brand new development for the most part. And like I said, that massive amount of land north of Indiana by 215 is open right now, but there may be some remediation issues. But if we're going to redevelop land, we own it. It's a large parcels, many parcels, and that seems to hold the key to any generation of income over here.
So maybe we could ask staff to come back to us based on our preliminary discussions around this project area and the dating of those with suggested, we can set it for any date that we want, but could you go back and look at those from years ago and come back to us with a suggestion for a start date for that tax increment?
Agree.
Stan?
Tammy, a couple of things. I know that, and Andrew, I'm wondering if you'd be receptive to this as well. One of the conversation we had really early on in the concept of this as an RDA area for that sort of what now an industrial zone was, rather than saying industrial park, just saying employment center, and maybe looking at the idea of connecting the employment centers that are already happening along the I-15 corridor with something out there on the 215 corridor and that connection. So I hope have you looked at that, and how does that factor into your plan?
Definitely. So the goal actually is calling out specifically employment centers, so that could be light manufacturing, but it doesn't have to be. It could be flex office or tech space or other.
Right, and that's kind of how I imagine providing a range of options out there. But I think the concept of looking at those connected employment centers makes a lot of sense. And then the other piece that I hope you'll incorporate into this is from the Transit Master Plan, which identifies the 9th South Corridor as one of those potential high-frequency connection corridors for transit. And it's something that I think makes a lot of sense in the concept of looking at moving people along an employment corridor, but also connecting potentially residents out to those two corridors on on either side of that district. So
sure, yes.
the other piece of that transit plan that I think is probably critical is the Redwood Road. And I think that may also already be under study or under process with UTA. And so looking at Redwood Road as a pretty high frequency corridor, has the opportunity of connecting this whole thing back up into light rail on the North Temple corridor potentially too. So if you could just consider those options.
Great suggestions. Thank you.
Thanks. And congratulations, Beth.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stan. Derek?
I don't have a question. I just want to make a comment on the 9-line project area. And that is that I am most excited about this project area. Of course, I think State Street has a lot of potential, but I'm really eager to see the redevelopment agency flex its muscle a little bit over the next 20 to 25 years in this part of town. I think that it has often been neglected, and there's enormous opportunity, in particular around as we look forward to the growth that's coming for our city, the opportunity to really build a city of neighborhoods and how we can mix the uses out on the west side along the 9 line. I'm really jazzed about the housing potential and infill opportunities that exist over here, as well as the connectivity and opportunities for trail connection and outdoor rec. So I really appreciate all the work that you have done for as far as public engagement goes. I think this is quite reflective of the community's desires, and so I just want to say thank you and congrats on all the hard work. So I'm looking forward to getting this finalized and launched.
Great.
Andrew?
Thank you. I agree. The Transit Master Plan is a good idea, Stan, but I think 9 South is a great idea. I don't think it's executable in the short term because of the train tracks, essentially. I do think the 13th and 4th as bookends to that west end could function similarly to attract Redwood Road. So if we're looking, which I hope we will, at the master transit plan being implemented much quicker than 20 years, those could be higher priority avenues to access economic development and employment centers and those kind of things. So.
Well, I can't speak for a future council, but should I be asked what I think? Absolutely faster than 20 years. I see it as a 10-year opportunity. So,
if we,
I think I hope you're hearing, Andrew, that I think the most exciting opportunity for me in that transit master plan that seems really ripe is that those connections from the downtown core to the west side, and Redwood Road seems very logical, especially if we have high frequency there. And as a high frequency, it could provide some very necessary services to a community that's lacking in transit that is trying to get to employment centers. So.
Well, I agree. Redwood Road is the last undevelopable land out there. maybe in a lot of the city other than North Temple. And 9th South, I think, is a core piece for me. I just see major barriers right now trying to connect 9th South as our corridor versus 4th and 13th in here and Redwood Road to connect to existing transit and other things. So I agree. Look at 9th South as a multimodal kind of concept, especially with the 9-line trail and connecting the entire city by foot and bike. I think the train is going to make it hard to make that a viable mass transit solution and other things. So,
further comments? Then I'm going to ask a few. I noted the questions that were brought up by RAC, and I think it would be helpful probably to the board to have you address those specifically. I think those are of note. And then also, when you talk about facilitate previously contaminated land in transitioning, I think it's important to look carefully and with our legal team to make sure that we are not ending up with having responsibility that could lead to litigation in the future. And I would love to see you lead out and set an example of how we can figure that out, because we have a lot of places in the city where we have people who want to come in and develop something, but they don't dare to because they are afraid they will be held liable forever and ever. And so if you came up with a great solution, that could be used citywide. So go for it.
All right.
Anything further on the 9-line? Okay. Thank you for the great work on this. It's exciting to see it moving. Yeah. Okay. Let's go to State Street.
All right. Thanks.
Life on State Street. How about that?
Yeah. Hopefully sometime. So yeah, as you have probably noticed, the State Street part of this presentation is organized the same way with the same goals or objectives. Our goals are slightly different in terms of trying to envision State Street as a vibrant destination in and of itself that's well served by transit, and that will be a safe and comfortable place for people to walk as well as shop and do just have destinations in the area. So that's kind of captured in the standards to guide project area development in terms of transit-oriented development, commercial development, and encouraging high aesthetic standards, and potentially working with Salt Lake City Planning Division to review existing zoning codes and any possible changes in the area. So the first objective here is on neighborhood revitalization, just like with the 9-line, and the tactics here include targeting underutilized lands for RDA resources, including acquisition of key properties, supporting historic preservation in the area where there are contributing structures, and then working with Planning Division on any zoning changes that might be appropriate. That's just sort of a summary of all of those tactics under that section. For Objective 2, the commercial corridors, these tactics focus on improving the identity and the beauty of State Street itself, as well as any other corridors in the area, like Main Street, that might be, could use some more neighborhood identification resources. And then supporting local businesses, including the ethnically diverse businesses that we already see in the area, and encouraging more neighborhood shopping nodes at corners where possible. For Objective 3, on employment centers, we'd be looking to work with economic development, the rest of economic development and business development to retain and recruit and expand businesses. State Street seems like a really logical place to increase office and that kind of commercial business, especially with it being so close to downtown and well served by transit, as well as housing and housing opportunities, work-live opportunities. And then also to balance office space with existing retail and use resources that are offered by the Main Streets USA designation, since that's been designated for that corridor from 600 South to 1300 South. So working with that program. Objective 4 is on housing and is pretty extensive with our tactics, but in general, we would want to support a wide range of housing options and choice. We've also talked about exploring the option of using a consultant to conduct a gentrification and displacement risk assessment to try to understand which populations might be most vulnerable in the area for displacement should redevelopment occur to the point where it's gentrified. And then we'd also be looking for partners for block stabilization or revitalization efforts for existing single-family housing stock in the project area. Objective 5 is on public spaces and transportation. Again, this is kind of the bulk of what we would probably be trying to do in a lot of ways in this, especially along the State Street corridor, in terms of working with UDOT to see what kinds of changes we might be able to make to the roadway and to increase pedestrian and bicyclist safety. Exploring options for increased open space or parks in the area, and also just TOD opportunities in general for both the State Street corridor, Main Street, and also around the track station at the ballpark. We'd be looking at. And then for geographic target areas, we have 4 that are currently designated with Block 16, which is the Sears block, a general area of about 1300 South and State, and then another general area around 1700 South and State, and then the current ballparks tracks, the ballpark track stop area. And I realize that I think that this got dropped through some iteration of this, but I believe at one point we had a geographic target area listed to leave open the possibility of having a geographic target area around any future light rail stop, if there were to be one.
17th South.
Yeah. Yeah, as far as I know, that's not really on UTA's short-range plan. I'm not sure about their long-range plan, but I've heard it spoken about a lot, so wanted to include that option as well.
Aaron, I bet you have a question or two.
A couple
Just
thoughts.
a couple
You could
thousand. Okay.
take or leave, but please don't leave them because I'm counting on it. And I'm only going to jump around a little bit. I'll start with the 1D, furthering the purposes, and the neighborhood revitalization. Back in January and February at our RDA meetings, we asked you to specifically put together priority areas around the 2 new HRCs, which is why we expanded our boundaries. So we'll get to the priority areas in a minute, where I want to see some priority areas around the homeless resource centers. But our board member Kitchen also talked then about asking staff to put together some neighborhood reinvestment strategies through the RDA as a part of this RDA project area. So I'm disappointed that we didn't see this. I had some meetings with some of the staff in Director Fritz's office about the needs of this area that ultimately have led to a project area creation, really, that have created the conditions for such a project area. And so I would like to have you come back to us again with more of a package of opportunities that address crime, which we know was the #1 priority for the awesome public engagement that the RDA did, that Life on State has done, and that I don't feel like is represented clearly enough in this document. I know that it says, as it does in the 9-line area, that in the highlight of our objective is part of it is to reduce crime, and that's a piece of the objective here. But I think I'd like us to try to get at it more strategically. So this could include things like lighting infrastructure as a priority, the specific prioritization of vacant or for sale properties, because I know from talking with you that the motels were #1 desire for acquisition and redevelopment in the public processes that we went through talking to residents and businesses, but I don't see that anywhere in here. Also, that we could prioritize connectivity as a mechanism for reducing crime in this area, and that is something that the RDA does well in other areas. Reducing hiding places intentionally in the developments that we participate in, perhaps addressing alleyways. And I just made this list up in a few minutes. So I know you guys can come up with some strategies that actually the RDA has done before in other areas, and that really get at that package of ideas that we asked for almost a year ago. So on that same page, it talks about key properties, and we talk about priority properties further in the document. And I'd like us to talk a little bit more about what those are. I don't know how, I know that there's some reasons that we shouldn't get too specific, but I'd like to see us get a little more specific because you guys did incredible public process in creating this plan. I'd like to see more of that reflected if that's possible. And if you need to come back and say we can't for this reason, then I think I need to hear that. So priority parcels. And then I wonder if we don't want to call out what catalytic projects would look like for this area. You know, that one on North Temple has been this elusive phantom of what is the catalytic project. And I think there have been some times when we've hoped it would be this or that. And I wonder if we don't want to actually say what those catalytic projects could be for this area in this document.
Just for this document. Is that what you're saying?
This is one of the few bites at the apple that this board gets, you know, and I want to have a little more clarity around what kind of catalytic projects could be brought to the city for the public's sake and the developer's sake, but also I think it gives us a...
I think that includes, because this is a new area, it would include the bonding opportunities, correct? Like we talked about just at our last presentation.
It could. And I would submit that the 9th South off-ramp that we funded a study on, I think that's about to kick off finally with transportation. I have a meeting this week with our new director for transportation about it. Do you guys remember that? An off-ramp utilization study, because it's like one of the biggest off-ramps in the Wasatch Front system, and it's not new, and it's expensive for UDOT to maintain, and it really divides the area that is within this project area. So that could be an incredible catalytic project if down the road it turns out that that off-ramp could be shortened and we could acquire that property. That's a really suited function that the RDA could take in terms of acquisition and redevelopment. Can I keep going?
And Woods.
Thank you. On objective 2, I just wanted to ask about the very first line on State Street, encouraging street trees. I know that this is in reference to the dialogues through Life on State with UDOT. We're talking about median, not park strip trees, right? And do we want to give a sense?
Depends on the layout that's ultimately proposed and selected.
And if they were not median, but they were park strip trees, then there's a real importance of timing, appropriate timing for that. And that's a really sensitive subject. I don't know, Danny, if you were here yet when those, I think you probably arrived after a lot of that public work happened, but there's a lot of sensitivity around, please don't come in and just plant trees, because right now they are harboring criminal activity. We're not yet to the point of redevelopment where that's a good thing for this area. So maybe we could include some language around timing or using a plan that better articulates the path to success and where, you know, that kind of implementation fits in. Okay, on page 3 with employment centers, it seems like we would be remiss if we didn't call out Salt Lake Community College, OC Tanner, and the Salt Lake County Complex as existing huge employment centers within this project area, partners in this project, potential partners in the project area. So will you please come back with some language that recognizes those? I know the ballpark is a large space, but it's not necessarily a large full-time employment center, but that, you know, I'm throwing this out to you, but at least SLIC, OC Tanner, and the county complex, I think, should be recognized and highlighted as opportunities for collaboration. Then moving on to objective 4 and housing. I really appreciate item B around using a third party to look at some quantification of the numbers and of humans, not just numbers, right, associated with the costs of gentrification and displacement. But the reality is, we know what the reality is, which is this is an area historically and currently that has been associated with human trafficking. And this is a place of immediate, affordable housing in the form of motels that we're looking to redevelop. And there will be people displaced unless we are quite intentional about providing continuity of housing opportunities for this area's population. And so I would like us to have a separate point in here that gets at what we talked about in our council meeting last week around continuity of housing as a priority for this body. And I would ask you to, come back to us with how you propose that we could phrase that. But we talked about that in our, was it growing SLC agenda item last week? I'm almost done, folks. So on to page 5, or objective 5 with public spaces and transportation. There's actually a lot of community momentum and work that's been done on the 17th South Tracks desire for this area. I think the community college is a potential partner in exploring that with UTA. And I would like to see that as a tactic for future exploration, that we explore 17th South Track stop potential with UTA and Salt Lake Community College. And then getting to the geographical focus areas. As I said earlier, I'd like to specifically call out the 2 homeless resource centers that we drew this area intentionally to include. I think that I'd propose that we unite areas 2 and 4. I don't understand why there's the break of a couple blocks in there west of the community college. Also
Madam Chair.
within that broken area is
Yeah,
the
just a second, Erin.
Asian Association. I think it's an important area to include.
Charlie?
So why is there a break? Do you know, Aaron?
Sure don't.
So RDA staff?
I think it's just a matter of they're not, we're drawing a bubble. We're not defining it on a property by property basis, but that's just one of those areas that you're looking at saying something major could happen here. I'm not sure there's any rhyme or reason beyond that other than just kind of targeting it as a node per se without really drawing the specific line.
Is there any benefit to having one contiguous RDA, so including that area that's not currently included, or is there?
The geographic
Does not
areas,
matter.
this is not a required component of the plan.
Yeah.
It's really more of just kind of to encourage this level of discussion of what are the priorities of the board and what are some of the things that we may want to call out. But it's not something that we necessarily have to put in the plan as a specific area of highlight because the entire project is going to be treated the same. It's really just a matter of identifying early projects or priorities that you may want to address or call out in the plan. So there's no rhyme or reason. We can combine it or we can eliminate them or just.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Aaron, I didn't mean to interrupt. It was
No,
just
it's a
just a
legitimate
relevant question that I couldn't figure out either. So.
Hey, Aaron, do you have more?
Yeah.
Okay.
So on the
Piggyback on that one.
geographical focus areas, I think that in adding the 2 HRCs, and I think that we should add the 9th South off-ramp area. There's work to be done on the study of utilization, but if it turns out that it's an underutilized ramp and UDOT believes that it's an underutilized ramp and they might be willing to enter into a discussion, it's totally within the lifetime of this project area. It could happen within 25 years that we could look at acquiring or assisting in the redevelopment of that off-ramp.
Aaron, I think Andrew had something he wanted to piggyback on.
It was the same idea about I know within a geographic area, we're trying to figure out where do you invest the money now to get tax increment later. Growth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Catalytic idea is to produce growth out of a small investment. Is that different than focus areas of maintenance or improvement in social sort of aspects that maybe don't yield a large amount of economic growth long term? I'm thinking of the HRCs being a place where there may not be a ton of economic growth in that little area versus, say, Block 16, which, if redeveloped, has a massive potential, right? Is there a way to call that out differently or look at them differently or allocate resources? My concern is that how do we allocate resources within your staff or time, or how much effort do you put in? Because if we take 2 and 3 and put them together, that's the size of some CRA areas total alone, not including everything else.
And I
so.
think what's coming out of this discussion is the question of whether we really do want to include the map of the target areas or speak to them just within the narrative of the plan itself. And it goes back to your point of how specific do you really want to start highlighting properties, because that does sometimes make it difficult to negotiate with property owners to buy them if they know that you've targeted them as a priority and they start to get greedy. And so I'm wondering if within the narrative we call out whether something is a project that we want to undertake or something that maybe we've just identified as a project that if it does happen, there's a social benefit to it or a social reason that we may want to do something in and around that area, and just speak to that within the narrative rather than try to define it property by property. And I think we can play around with that at the staff level and see if we want to come up with an idea and some proposals within the final plan, and then have that discussion with the board of whether that's the level of detail you were looking for, or whether it's something that you would want to somewhat identify the different types of uses that we could target. So we can take a look at that based on the comments here and see if we can kind of figure out how you'd like to incorporate that within the final plan and make sure it meets the goals and objectives and really calls it out the way you would like to do it based on what the project is or the demand.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I look at this area and think of, geez, I don't know where you start. Frankly, there's maybe if you add in the possibility long term, like Aaron's talking about it, the 9th Ave South on ramp. I mean, there's just so much in this area you could look at doing if you had the time and the resource, right?
Yeah.
And how do you prioritize? Because in the next 2 years, the HRCs are coming online, and that probably needs to be a major priority just to make sure that we don't undermine growth already happening on 3rd West and on the north part of State Street. But there's other areas that with some investment could yield a massive return. So I guess that's my question about how do you figure that out and prioritize time and effort in here. And
I would say what you generally do at this level of the plan, again, this plan is a statutory requirement, and it's something that you want to identify what your goals and objectives are, but you also don't want to limit yourself and put yourself in a box. And so you generally try to address it at a more broad and generic level that also provides you the opportunity as you go in and activate the plan to have those provisions. And so whether you call out specific properties, I don't know if you'd want to say that as much as property types. And so I wouldn't want to call out specific motels as much as I would want to say something like identify problem properties or properties that provide the opportunity for an economic impact. And so there's that fine line between giving you, the board, what you want in terms of details, but also building in the flexibility that over the 20 plus years that you're going to implement this plan, you've provided all the opportunities and you haven't necessarily hurt yourself in any negotiations or restrictions.
What's the time frame again on adoption on this? This spring?
We were hoping this spring.
The spring?
Yeah.
I don't insert myself too much here, but I think the 2 HRCs would be something I'd probably want to look at quickly as far as some infrastructure upgrades if we're going to look at it here. I don't know if that's a priority area. I don't know if you call that out specifically, but it seems like we included those specifically. That's not a secret to make sure that's a part of our initial discussions coming very quickly, if that's amenable.
Tammy, what were you going to say?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely within our authority to discuss what we want to prioritize in this document right now, because it is one of the few bites at the apple that we get.
Yeah,
I know you've talked about that before, so I didn't want to jump into already.
Another consideration, if we rewind a year back to the real property disposition discussion, a Tier 1 property, one of the criteria is if it's defined in a project area, specifically called out in a project area plan or a master plan.
Right.
So that was a year ago contemplated through the project area creation process by identifying these specific target areas. So you will have there will be the higher standard of reporting requirements if the parcels are specifically called out in the project area plan.
So when I was asking about what are the priority areas, how do we define priority parcels? It is these geographic highlighted areas that are the priorities.
Or it could be property types. I mean, if it's a motel, then that's called out as a priority property, whether it's a specific address or whether it's just a type of property. So
And where is it called out?
where is it called out in this? We
Yeah.
haven't gotten to that level of detail. That's within the plan and when you start identifying specific projects.
But those are all currently included in these these yellow squares. We try to encompass as many of those properties as possible.
I think that speaks to the desire to unite 2 and 4 there, that they're, I can't think off the top of my head that there's a motel right there, but I know that there is a drop-in center that wishes they could provide overnight accommodations for human trafficking survivors in that area, and there are houses there that would probably, we would want to prioritize potentially. Okay, I just had one other thing, and it would fall under the housing. I've been flitting around trying to figure out where I would put this, but I would like us to include a specific point in the housing section to provide public infrastructure specific to social services. And we do this in the Depot District project area, where we call out social services as a category we want to address in that project area. I would like us to go on to say that that we provide social services specific to the needs of human trafficking survivors who are historically and currently associated with this area, to give us the opportunity to work with the growing community supporters from the district attorney's office to domestic violence centers to the Junior League and others who want to work with government agencies in order to create those kind of services, and this is where they are. So I would like us to specifically call that out. And I think housing is the area, but if you want to suggest another section in the document, I'm open to that. That's all, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Sure. James and then Stan.
So I guess, Aaron, my question goes back to boundaries. I read somewhere in the staff report that it talked about the west side of Main Street that the RAC recommended including. Is that correct?
Yes.
Can you tell me the reasoning why behind they came back and said they wanted the west side of Main Street included?
I think they just felt that there's a lot of development potential there. And so if you expand that to the west side of Main Street, then you're encompassing that new development potential. However, in thinking about it a little bit more, it's also, I mean, it's not a question of whether or not we'll be included in the project area. It's included in the project area, whether or not it's in the geographic target area. It's, that west side of Main Street would be available, all the same programs and
So then why
available.
point it out in the staff report?
I just wanted to bring to the board everything that RAC recommended so that you could see what their recommendation was in terms of what they thought maybe should be included. Since you're not in those meetings directly yourselves, then...
So, but it being included, then we don't need to worry about it.
I don't really think so. I mean, it's not too hard to expand it if that's the way we decide to go. If we decide to stick with these geographic target areas, we can easily bump that line over. But in my mind, it's not super necessary to expand that area because it will still, all those properties will still have the same resources available to them.
Is that the same with the on-off, actually just the off-ramp of Night South?
I think that's potentially true. I mean, I think sometimes when we talk about these geographic target areas, there's a tendency to sort of start thinking about them as if this is where the resources are going to be available, but really they will be available throughout the project areas. These are just specific areas that we're looking at that had some particular reason why we might want to take a closer look or have the properties be Tier 1 properties to be reported to the board.
And yeah, and I think that that's just the only clarification to make. I think Tammy made it before, that the difference is in the reporting and in the board's, I think maybe you could say, level of oversight. So if there's a particular property that you feel especially that you feel needs that level of oversight or, you know, reporting or discussion, then that might be a cause to expand that boundary. And if not, I think your point is good, that it's the same resources would be available. It's just in terms of the real property disposition policy, that's what kicks it into a different category, if that makes sense.
Madam Chair, and
Yes.
if you look at the map, we don't include the off-ramp. We cut it out in our last boundary discussion. There's that blue dotted line up to 7th South. And so the area that we'd be highlighting is actually south of the off-ramp, not within the off-ramp.
Right.
So we allocated the money for that utilization study so long ago, and no one did anything with it. And now it seems it's moving ahead. So I think we were having the boundary discussion today, I would be lobbying to keep that 9th South off-ramp within this project area. Is it too late for us to bump up that area to 900 South where it currently is at, what is that?
I think that's already a project area.
It's in the granary, isn't it?
Yes.
To Main Street or to?
Yes, to Main Street.
Yeah.
West Temple Gateway.
The West Temple Gateway.
And that one, what did you say, West Temple
West
Gateway?
Temple Gateway.
And our expiration date on that is what?
2018.
Well, son of a gun. I think it would be a shame for us to lose this block to the expiration of that project area. And is there a way to absorb it into this one at the expiration of that one? Or would we
I think
double
we'd have
cover
to-
it?
Yeah, I think we'd have to look at what the dynamics are of double covering it, because that's an older project area where this is now a CRA, so they could potentially opt into that as part of the negotiation. So we can look at that in return.
It might affect your beginning date. So if you backdate the rest of the State Street project area, you might not be able to backdate that area. So there might be a sub area, but maybe that's something to talk about with the attorney's office.
Yeah, it's a matter
Work out.
Could you get
can't
back
collect
to us with
tax
that?
increment twice.
And
Yeah,
so I'm
we'll
talking
look
about
at that.
9th South,
Yeah.
south from 3rd West, east. Thanks.
Stan?
Yeah, could you just talk to me a little bit about in the public process, two of the components of this area seem like they could potentially be conflicting. We make reference to neighborhood business nodes, and this seems like a challenge in this neighborhood on State Street, that the neighborhood sort of concept of that. So just wondering how that gets defined maybe in that public process, or did that come out of that process? And also the concept of State Street as a significant transportation corridor. And we had made some comparisons early on in this process to some models like Austin that have done some pretty significant work on almost not reinforcing, but acknowledging the sort of car nature of that and how that might interact along the corridor and with businesses and with residential. So how did that mesh in the public process, or did it?
I don't know if it got that specific in the public process. I think that in answer to your first question about neighborhood nodes, what we heard was that people wanted places that they could walk to, like corner grocery stores and things like that, that they could walk to, and they could have things in their neighborhood that they need, those resources, without having to drive. So having those kind of neighborhoods where everything's kind of right there was what we heard, and that this is a great potential area for it because of also the access by transit. So again, you might not need a car necessarily if there were more amenities and things of that nature that were in that corridor. So that's where kind of that neighborhood node part came out of it.
Was there a sense or a desire in that public process to look at State Street in particular, not necessarily the other areas, as a corridor that needed to be emphasized, identified, sort of in a place-making kind of way?
Yeah, I thought so. You know, we heard from people, we don't have any of those banners, like when you go into other neighborhoods, like 9th and 9th, but we don't, that call that out, and it's a real sense of place and that identity.
So I'm thinking of the Marmalade and 300
Yes.
West and sort of the
Yeah.
work the RDA did there
Right.
of looking at that transit corridor, transportation corridor,
Uh-huh.
as an opportunity to give the whole area some shared identity. And I'm just wondering how that works into your plan, or is that something that's down the road with the plan? And I'm just a little concerned's not the right word. I'm hoping we don't lose that opportunity of connectivity along that corridor or identity along that corridor in the process of looking at very specific sort of target problem areas.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I think there's one spot, one goal, one tactic where we say that we want to promote the identity of the area, and also, and it came out of Life on State, I believe. I'd have to find it where it is right now. But
and
that
maybe
is something that I
it's just something to watch, and board members, maybe I'll just suggest that I think there's a really interesting opportunity from I-80 up right into the core of downtown to give some personality to this corridor that helps identify it and might help get some of that, in some ways, a neighborhood feel. I think that's kind of what the goal was and what happened on 300 West, although it's not entirely complete, but the idea of the medians and the lamp posts and some banners eventually, but really to call out the connectivity of the neighborhood there, and there might be an opportunity we might want to reinforce. Certainly not get lost in looking at specific problem target areas.
there's probably a way to call it out a little bit more specifically in its own,
Okay.
bullet or section.
And
then
I know there's some work happening there already. There's a State Street project sort of
Yeah, the Life on
conversation that's been
State.
happening. Yeah, so
Mhm.
I just would want to make sure we incorporate that. So.
Yeah, and I would say that that's kind of a similar answer to your second question about like the auto-oriented nature of that roadway. And the next step for the Life on State process is to look more closely at the transportation needs and assessments and do more in-depth modeling in terms of what kind of changes could be made to the roadway. Certainly UDOT is very intent on keeping the capacity there
Right.
for automobiles, but then there's also a question of it's a really wide right-of-way, and could we use the space more effectively, and could we share the space more?
Well, and I
So-
think the RDA had some good experience collaborating with UDOT on 300 West,
Yes.
and the starting point was very similar.
Yeah.
Protect the capacity,
Right.
but we still did some neighborhood defining things in that process. So
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, and there's, a little left
Thank
to
you.
go there, but
Thanks.
thanks.
Okay, well, Erin's out of the room. Is there anyone else who has anything? And she's back. Okay, did you think of another question while you're out there? Okay. Want you to have full opportunity. This is an important area. That's why we're spending the time on it. It's good.
We will be back
Um,
with this in
I-
other
we will be
iterations.
back.
Yes.
Madam
Okay.
Chair,
Yes.
just, because it's a question I always ask, what's your expected timeline? Where are we in the process? When do you expect to come back to the body with additional information or some refined thoughts?
I think our next step back would be February. We have the component that we're going to take to RAC in January, and I think we anticipate taking the information we've received today and bringing back the next step in February.
Okay, very good. Thanks. Great report. I know we put you off and we put you off and we put you off, and you finally got to present, and we appreciate an excellent presentation. And I think we were able to generate a lot of questions and ideas for you to move forward. I hope it was helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And we will now move to item, I want to make sure I've got it right, number 6 on our agenda. This is an update on the predisposition property report on the overnighter motel. And who is going to present on this? None other than the COO of the RDA, Danny Walls. Is it?
I will present it
Okay.
under the caveat that I thank staff because they're the ones who've been doing all the work on this, and they've done an amazing job in terms of diving into the overnighter motel and managing and maintaining it. Our property manager, Jim, Ed Butterfield, and Tammy have really stepped up, and this has been an interesting project to take on, and they've done a fantastic job of closing on that acquisition and now getting it in position to move forward.
Thank you to them for that.
Yes.
We know they had to move quickly, and they weren't anticipating it, so thank you so
So
much.
what you have in front of you is the predisposition property report, and essentially what this is memorializing a lot of the direction we received from the board in terms of acquiring that property. And so what you have is we will put out after the first of the year RFP process for the project. That project will involve a 50-50 mix between the affordable and market rate units. It will incorporate a range of incomes within that. We have provided the inclusion also of a commercial component within that to activate the streetscape, as well as identifying that it needs to fit within the transit station area district zoning. And then we will also add the components of energy efficient building and sustainability. And we had the timeline. I know originally the original motion for acquiring the property, board directed staff to get that out by the end of the year. We felt it was important, however, to take this project to the community councils and get their input in terms of what they'd like to see as part of that. And between that and the demand that we normally see over the holidays for RFPs, we figured we could postpone that till after the first of the year. And so with the board's approval of that, that's the schedule we will proceed with.
Is there any discussion about it or any further questions about it? It looks like Stan and then Aaron.
I just wondered if you need action on our part, or if you're just looking for a A-OK.
No, I think at this point, we're just reporting what the process is, and
Okay.
then we can continue to provide those updates, and then to the extent that anything needs to come back to the board, we'll do that.
Let me do this just to give you the go-ahead. I'm going to do a straw poll on those who are comfortable with extending the period of time a bit to have the RFP so that they get all the components right, rather than having it by the end of the year. All in favor of that? Okay, that's unanimous, and James is not present. Okay, Aaron, did you have a question?
I wondered if we'd be encouraging a mix of affordability. I see the 60% and below.
Yeah, we anticipate that that's just the below, and then we would have a range and a mix within that.
Great,
Yes.
thanks.
Anything else? Board members? All right.
Thank you, Danny.
Thanks
for
so
the
much.
response.
Great work on that. Item number 7, report and announcements from the executive director. The mayor's not with us. David, do you have anything? Okay. Then report and announcements from the RDA staff.
Yes, I would like to call up Laura Fritz, and she's going to speak to the board. And as she's coming up, Madam Chair, I would like to reiterate your comment from the very beginning of the meeting of how we used to number board meetings, and I'm not sure it felt like performances as much as it may have felt like a prison sentence at times. You recognize how long you'd been with the agency when you saw that number getting much larger, so I'm glad we did away with that as well.
And on behalf of the RDA staff, we'd like to thank you, Chairwoman Adams, for your service to our community, and also to you, Councilmember Penfold. The RDA has accomplished a great amount under your leadership, and it's because of the partnership between the board and staff that we're able to make great things happen for our community. So we just wanted to give you a small token of appreciation for everything you've done. And we look forward to everything you're going to continue to do for our community, even if you aren't serving as the chair or a board member of the RDA. So thank you for your service. Thank you for your commitment to our team. And we'll look forward to continuing to do great things together.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Oh, perfect. Thanks so much. No, I won't open an umbrella inside. This is good. This is good. Okay, we know better than to open it. Thank you. It's an umbrella, and it says whatever the weather. That's board member. You've been. Oh, I've got yours, Stan. Thanks. Whatever the weather, we've been with them. We appreciate it.
Every time I use it, I'll think of you.
Okay. And next item, report of the chair and the vice chair. So I actually have something. And I'm going to ask Laura to come back up, and I have something for each of you. And I needed to hand the blue one to Danny. I knew he'd be wearing a blue shirt. And, and I need you to open those. Those are really something very special that I know you'll be thrilled to have. And that I'm just thrilled to give you this really elegant gift. Since I know neither of you were really
Wear that too.
You were never
overnighter badge, and I can speak on behalf of our property manager, Jim. He will be thrilled to be able to point out that we are officially now the staff of the overnighter, and we should be handling those calls and problems. Thank you.
Well, I knew
I've
that-
had a lot of name tags in my job history, and this is
I knew
this is the best.
I knew neither of you really truly wanted to own a motel, but if you're going to, you need to have people know your management. So there you go. So
We'll wear it proudly.
Thank you for your help in working with us. We appreciate that. And now we'll be serious for a minute. Are there questions on the written briefings? And on item C, I was actually going to put that before 9 and I forgot. One thing I would just note, in that C1 is the semi-annual list of owned property by the RDA, and to George's point, Danny is well aware that we own way more than we want to own, other than the overnighter.
We
which
do,
we'll
yes.
be finding somebody to own. Do
We-
you want to
we
address
do,
that a
and
little bit?
Yes, since I've come on, Jim, our property manager, has brought a lot of those issues to my attention. There are several properties that when you look through those that the RDA either really does not need to own anymore and that we should dispose of because our purpose has been served, and or there's a lot of properties there that are in various stages of either marketing, planning, or negotiations for disposition. To Mr. Chapman's concern, just this week we've been working with the administration on trying to identify if any of the current RDA projects, or properties I should say, would work for extending storage. We have the facility right now within the Station Center building. Apparently they have outgrown that, and so we have been trying to identify other options. We have some. Unfortunately, most of those do require some level of either rehab or improvements to the properties because the properties have either been vacant or bought in a state that really does not lend well to use. And so we're continuing to have that conversation and see if we can find a solution.
And I want to just say, a place for your stuff is something I think the RDA can feel really proud of. When it was first initiated, people didn't believe it would really be a good spot for their stuff, and we only had like 50 people who would be there, and now we're to capacity and we need more. And I think it demonstrates the very thing that we've talked about over and over again. It's really tough to have a job if you don't have a place to put your stuff to go to work. So do that. Another thing I want to thank you for is your help on getting the Candy Cane Corner a location. RDA provided one last year, and this year they're across the street over here. I think that makes a great difference in our community. And also that we were able to work out a place to have Fill the Pot with Calvary Baptist Church in an RDA property, and they make a huge difference for good in our community. So
Yeah, I think
thanks for being a partner on all those important projects.
Fill the Pot is one that we're proud to work with. Candy Cane Corner, I believe, has worked with Hand on their current location.
Right.
We weren't able to accommodate them this year, but we've done that in the past, and so we're
taking care of it. And if there are no further questions, then we stand adjourned. Thank you very much. And Mr. Chair, when do you want to start?
If we could reconvene as City Council at 1:15, that'd be great. We have about 4 items on our agenda.
Okay, excellent. Thank you.